I remember the sound of my brother's laughter that night, loud, confident, echoing through the same walls our father built. He had no idea that I already knew what he'd done. The papers he forged, the company he stole, the legacy he thought was his forever. When I looked at him across that dinner table, smiling like the king of the world, I said nothing. I didn't need to, because by then, every piece of his empire already belonged to me, quietly, legally, and without a single fight. If you've ever been betrayed by your own family and wished for justice without a word, stay. This story will show you how silence can be louder than revenge. Subscribe now, because the calm ones always win in the end. Before everything fell apart, my brother and I were just two kids running around our father's workshop covered in dust and ideas. He used to build small wooden boxes and say, "One day, both of you will build something much bigger, together." I believed him. I always believed him. Our father's business wasn't huge, but it was honest. A small construction company built from years of sweat and patience. Everyone respected him for that. The man who never cheated, never rushed, never lied. When he passed away, the company and his shares were divided between us. I didn't think too much about it then. I trusted my brother completely. He was older, smarter with money, and he spoke like he understood every rule of business. I, on the other hand, was still studying. My focus was different, books, not numbers. I wanted to help the company grow someday, but for that moment, I let him handle things. He said, "You don't need to worry about paperwork. I'll take care of everything." And I smiled, believing him like I always had. He started dressing differently, suits every day, new car, expensive watch. I thought it was success, the kind that makes a family proud. He even began talking about our company in big business meetings. But slowly that word, our, began to fade. At first it was small. My name disappeared from the website, then from the business cards. When people talked about the company, they only mentioned him. I told myself it didn't matter. He was just representing both of us. That's what brothers do. But the truth was, I didn't notice how neatly he was erasing me, one document at a time. Every weekend, we still had family dinners. He would talk about numbers I didn't understand, using words like shares and growth. I just nodded, pretending to follow. Maybe I should have asked more questions. Maybe I should have seen it then, how every smile of his was just a cover for something bigger. Looking back now, those dinners were rehearsals. He was preparing for his grand performance, the moment he'd make sure my name vanished completely from the life our father left behind. And when that moment came, I was the last one to know. It started with a phone call I almost didn't answer. My brother's voice was calm, too calm. "Hey, I just need you to sign a few forms," he said. "It's just to make tax stuff easier. Nothing major. I was busy with schoolwork, so I didn't think twice." He sent the papers through email, neat, professional, full of terms I didn't understand. He'd always handled the business, so I trusted him. I scrolled down, saw my name, and signed where he told me to. It took less than a minute. I had no idea that Click had changed everything. A few weeks later, I went to the company office to surprise him. His assistant looked nervous when I walked in. She said, "He's in a meeting, but maybe you shouldn't wait." That was strange. I waited anyway. When I finally walked into the room, he froze. Around the table sat new investors, and on the screen was a presentation. My father's company, but with my brother listed as the only owner. My name was gone. Not forgotten. Removed. I remember staring at the screen, then at him. He smiled, pretending nothing was wrong. "Oh yeah, the papers you signed? I had to move your shares temporarily. It's easier for funding." "Temporarily?" I asked. My voice cracked a little. He nodded, avoiding eye contact. "Of course. You trust me, right?" That line hit me like a knife. I wanted to shout, to grab the papers and tear them apart. But everyone in the room was watching. So I did what he didn't expect. I smiled back. That night, I checked the company records online. My name wasn't there. The system showed his signature and mine, approving the transfer of ownership. My heart dropped. He had sold my share, legally. For days, I replayed everything in my head, every time I had trusted him, every time I had stayed quiet. He didn't just take my money. He took my father's trust too, and that night I made a quiet promise. I wasn't going to take it back through anger. I was going to make him lose it, piece by piece, the same way he took it from me. After that night, everything looked the same from the outside, but I had changed inside. The office, the family dinners, even the smell of my father's old workshop, all of it felt hollow now. I kept hearing his words in my head. Whatever happens, keep the family together. But how do you hold a family together when your own blood robs you with a smile? I tried to talk to my brother again, hoping there had been some mistake. I called him one afternoon. His tone was flat, businesslike. "It's already done," he said. "You shouldn't worry about things you don't understand. Things I don't understand." That line stayed with me for weeks. He had turned the same patience I once admired into arrogance. The company that used to smell of wood and sweat now smelled of polished glass and expensive perfume. My brother had turned it into something shiny, something hollow. He hired new people, loud, careless, greedy. I saw how they flattered him, how they laughed at his jokes, and when I entered the room, the laughter stopped. At family gatherings, my aunt whispered, "He's the smart one, you know." She never cared about business anyway. It hurt. I wanted to defend myself, to tell them that I did care, that I had trusted him to take care of both of us. But instead, I smiled politely, just like I had learned to do. Meanwhile, my brother's wealth kept growing. He bought a new house, hosted parties, even started talking about merging the company with a bigger one. He loved the attention, the praise, the spotlight. He had everything he wanted, the business, the respect, and a sister too quiet to cause trouble. But he didn't know that silence can be sharper than a blade. I spent nights reading everything I could about shares, ownership laws, and corporate rights. I didn't understand much at first, but I was learning. I needed to know how he did it, how he made it look so clean. When I finally looked deeper, I realized something else. The company wasn't his strength. It was his weakness. He had built his new world on debts, loans, investors, promises. He was rich only as long as everyone believed he was untouchable, and that belief, I decided, would be the first thing I'd take from him. He thought he had won because he owned my father's legacy. But what he didn't realize was that every empire built on lies is already half broken. All I had to do was wait for the right crack to appear. It happened on a quiet Sunday. I was cleaning out my father's old desk, the one he used to sit at every evening, sorting bills, marking notes, drawing up plans. It still smelled faintly of sawdust and coffee. Most of the drawers were empty, but one stuck a little when I tried to open it. I pulled harder and a small envelope slipped out from the back. It had my name on it. Inside were a few folded papers, old company statements, signed drafts, and one thin letter in my father's handwriting. It wasn't long, but one line burned into me. "In case anything ever feels wrong, start with the numbers." That's when I noticed something strange on the statements. The signatures didn't match, not perfectly, but enough to make me pause. The first one was my real signature from years ago, the one I used before college. The next few looked similar but weren't exact. The pressure, the curve, even the ink, different. I sat down on the floor, surrounded by papers, reading every line. And then I saw it, an old document showing the original division of shares. My name had 30% ownership. The new document my brother had shown investors? 0. The difference wasn't just money, it was control. That night, I couldn't sleep. I opened my laptop, logged into public company records, and searched everything. My hands were shaking. I found files, meeting notes, and even scanned copies of documents. One of them, the very paper I had signed, except it wasn't the same one. He had added new pages, extra lines, new dates, and signatures copied from older forms. He hadn't tricked me into signing a transfer. He had created one. It was clear now. My brother hadn't just lied. He had forged. But instead of running to the police or shouting at him, I did what he never expected. I stayed silent. I closed the laptop, took a deep breath, and decided that this time, silence would be my weapon. I would learn everything he thought I couldn't. The laws, the numbers, the very language he used to erase me. And when I came for him, he wouldn't even know it until it was too late. That night, as I put my father's letter back into the drawer, I whispered softly, "Don't worry. Dad, I'll start with the numbers." And I did. I started small. The first week after I found the papers, I read everything I could find about shares and ownership. I sat in the library for hours with thick books and slow internet articles. At night, I watched free lectures about business law and company rules. At first, the words were heavy and strange, but bit by bit, they made sense. I wrote notes in a little notebook and drew simple diagrams so I could see how the pieces fit together. I knew I could not fight him loudly. If I yelled or made a scene, he would hide everything faster. So I needed quiet moves that looked normal to other people. My plan had 3 parts: learn, prepare, and buy. Learning was the hardest at the start. I signed up for a short online course the week after. The teacher used plain words, and I practiced until I could explain a loan or a shareholder vote in 1 sentence. That made me feel safer. Knowledge felt like a tool I could hold. Next came preparation. I opened small bank accounts under different names. Not fake names, but small businesses I set up with real paperwork. I asked a lawyer for a cheap consultation and paid in cash for privacy. The lawyer showed me how to make safe, legal companies that could hold shares or buy debt. I also found an older accountant who worked quietly and knew how creditors think. I paid him with small checks so nothing looked strange. He became my hidden helper. He checked numbers and explained what the banks look for. Then I bought pieces that mattered. I started with tiny things, small notes, short-term debts that no one else wanted. When people in my town needed cash fast, I quietly bought their IOUs for less than they were worth. It felt like collecting small stones, each one not worth much alone, but together they make a wall. I used the shell companies to hide that all the stones came from me. When the brother took a risky loan to grow the company, I already owned a part of that loan. It gave me a quiet lever over him. I practiced being ordinary in public. I smiled at family dinners and asked about his new projects. I went to the office with a polite face and never rushed. People saw the same sister as always, calm, not a threat. That helped me move without raising alarms. At night, I worked on spreadsheets and dates, checking when debts would need payment and where the company was weak. I marked possible moments when investors would ask for proof, or when a bank might freeze an account if shown the right paper. Sometimes I felt lonely doing all this. I missed arguing with him like we used to when we were kids. But I reminded myself that revenge does not need noise. It needs patience and the right timing. Each small purchase and paper I filed was a stitch in a quiet net. The plan was not cruel for show. It was precise and slow. I was building proof, control, and safety, step by step, until the day I could pull the net tight and let him fall into the space he made for himself. Once the plan was ready, I moved slowly but with purpose. The first real step was to find where his money relied on other people. The loans, the investors, the small promises no one looked at twice. I made a list of every weak spot I could find. A short-term loan that needed payment next month, a contractor who had been paid late, a supplier who asked for quicker cash. I wrote down dates and amounts. Those small things looked harmless alone, but together they pointed to a place I could push. I started buying pieces of the weak spots. If a contractor had a small IOU from the company and needed cash now, I offered to buy it for less than its full value. I told them I needed a small investment for a project I was starting. They needed cash faster than they needed the full price, so they sold. I used the small companies I had set up to buy these notes. No one in the town wondered why those little companies were buying odd debts. They looked like normal business moves. But each IOU I bought gave me a tiny claim on the company's money later. Think of it like picking up seeds that will grow into a tree when watered at the right time. While I bought debts, I also watched the company accounts closely. The accountant I had hired quietly checked bank statements and loan terms. He taught me how banks treat unpaid notes and when they can freeze accounts. We looked for clauses that allowed lenders to call loans early if certain payments missed. One such clause would become very important later. I made notes of every date that could cause trouble for my brother, loan renewals, interest payment days, and investor review meetings. Timing was everything. Next, I worked on the legal side. I arranged for the forensic accountant to start a private review of some old documents. Nothing public, just a quiet check. This told me where forged entries might hide and which signatures looked copied. The accountant wrote a short private memo showing irregularities without naming anyone. I kept that memo locked away. It was proof for me, not a weapon to shout with yet. I also set up a few small demands through the shell companies. When a short-term loan came due, I quietly asked for payment of the IOU I owned. This made the company move money, show its cash flow, and sometimes show where it had borrowed more. Each time they paid, they revealed more of their structure. When they could not pay, it created small cracks, calls to the bank, an anxious email to an investor. I did not push too hard. I pushed just enough to watch how people panicked and where they ran for help. There was a moment I will never forget. My brother announced an expensive expansion plan and asked investors for more money. He laughed loudly in a meeting and promised the world. I felt nothing on the outside. Behind the scenes, I used that same week to call in a few of the small notes I had bought. The company had to move money to cover them. Banks started to ask questions about cash flow. That was the lever I needed. The timing was perfect because his pride made him take bigger risks. All the while, I kept my face calm at home. I smiled at family dinners and asked about his new projects like a good sister. He never saw the small purchases on my side. He never knew that his loud promises would meet private demands I had quietly set. My plan was not to hurt people for cruelty. It was to right a wrong and expose the house of cards he had built. Piece by piece, the company began to wobble. Investors watched the numbers and frowned. Lenders sent polite, firm emails. Employees whispered and worried. Everything I had done was small alone, but together it became a steady pressure that pointed exactly where the company could break. I had built a net from tiny threads, and now I only needed the right moment to pull it tight. The day came quietly, like any other morning, but everything felt heavy with the small moves I had made. The company held its annual meeting in the big glass boardroom, the same room where my brother once smiled and promised to keep our father's name alive. Investors filled the chairs, their faces polite but tired. My brother walked in like he owned the place, chest forward, voice smooth. He began the usual speech about growth and future plans. He had practiced this smile for years. I sat in the back, calm and invisible. The forensic accountant I had hired sat beside me with a thin folder. He had enough proof to make a careful case: mismatched signatures, odd transfers, and the loan notes I had quietly bought that showed the company's real money flow. He would not shout. He would show the truth in simple documents that any bank, judge, or investor could read and understand. That was the point: make the facts speak for themselves. When the Q&A began, I raised my hand. My voice sounded small, ordinary, like any worried shareholder. I asked about a short-term loan that was due and why the company had used a new account to move funds the same week my notes were called. My brother answered with practiced confidence, speaking fast and smiling. But then the forensic accountant stood up and handed a clean printout to the board chair. He pointed to the dates and the ink marks, to the signatures that did not match the old ones my father used. He explained how certain payments matched the IOUs I had bought, and how one clause in a lender's contract could allow funds to be frozen if a demand was made. Silence filled the room like a held breath. An investor leaned forward, a lawyer frowned, and a bank representative made a quiet call. The accountant spoke calmly, reading the ledger lines one by one. He showed that some payments had been moved after new papers appeared. He showed that an investor had been told different facts than the public records showed. Facts do not need drama. Facts only need to be clear. Within the hour, the bank called the company's primary account and placed a temporary hold. The room shifted. Phones lit up and hands trembled slightly. My brother's smile faltered for the first time that day. He tried to explain that everything was routine, that numbers can be confusing, but now the numbers were all anyone cared about. The lawyer for the investors asked that the company pause the merger talks until an independent review was finished. Cameras in the hall whispered through the glass, sensing a story. My brother's voice became thin. He had no dramatic speech left. His investors stood and asked for meetings. His closest manager avoided eye contact. A woman from the bank said the freeze would remain until the documents were cleared. The chair of the board turned to him and asked for proof that the transfers were legal. He reached for papers, but his hands trembled. He had built his life on confident words, on the idea that no one would look too closely. I watched everything like someone watching a careful clock. I felt no joy like triumph. I felt a strict cold relief, the kind that follows a long, slow plan finally working. When the chair announced a temporary takeover committee to protect the company and its employees, the room began to move with new authority. Men who had laughed at me months ago now listened as the accountant explained the irregularities. My brother tried to bargain, but the tools he had used, false signatures, rushed transfers, secret loans, were now chains that held him. After the meeting, people gathered in small groups, their voices low. My brother left the room in a rush, his face pale, his usual swagger broken. I walked past him without stopping. He looked at me once, eyes searching for anger or mercy. I gave him neither. I only held the quiet knowledge that the truth had been shown and that justice had started its slow work. Outside, as the meeting broke up, the bank's legal team announced they would perform a full audit. The investor group put certain funds on hold. The company's board called for an emergency review. The small IOUs I had bought were now the reason they had to explain themselves. The papers I had found in my father's desk had become the thread that unraveled everything my brother had patched together. The house of cards did not fall with a shout. It fell with a ledger, a printed line, and the steady reading of facts that no lie could hold. The weeks after the board meeting felt unreal. The company I had grown up around, the one that once smelled of sawdust and sweat from my father's hands, now echoed with quiet panic. Phones rang endlessly. Lawyers walked through the halls like ghosts carrying files. Every face that used to smile at my brother now looked away. The bank froze all major accounts for review. Suppliers demanded payment before delivery. The expansion deal collapsed within days. It wasn't loud, but it was final. The company stopped breathing. At home, silence sat heavier than ever. My brother barely left his room. The same man who used to talk about winning and being the smart one now couldn't look anyone in the eye. Mom cried quietly at night, torn between her children. She didn't understand how deep the lies had gone, but she understood that something had broken that could never be fixed again. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I had already done what I came to do: prove the truth. My revenge wasn't about shouting or destroying everything my father built. It was about pulling out the rot that had spread inside it. My father's name, his work, his values, they deserved better than to be used by someone who traded them for greed. A few days later, a letter came from the bank. They had completed their review. The board had agreed to remove my brother from management and hand temporary control to a trustee until the company could be restructured. Attached was a small note from the same lawyer who had first helped me set up my shell companies. Ownership restored to original share division pending audit. Congratulations. Quietly done. Quietly done. Exactly how I wanted it. I drove to my father's old office that evening. The building was mostly empty, files packed, chairs stacked. In the corner sat the same desk where I had found his letter. Start with the numbers. I placed the new letter beside it, the one confirming my rightful share. For a moment I imagined him there, smiling the same small, proud smile he used to give when I solved something on my own. I whispered, "I started with the numbers, Dad, and I ended with them too." The next morning, I met my brother for the first time since the fallout. He was sitting in a quiet cafe, the same one where he used to brag about deals. His face looked older now, smaller somehow. He didn't speak first. He just stared at his coffee, then muttered, "You wanted everything, didn't you?" I shook my head. "No, I wanted honesty." "You just made that impossible," he didn't reply. For the first time in his life, he had no argument left. No clever defense, just silence. I stood up to leave, but before walking away, I said softly, "You could have had everything, you know. But greed never builds, it only eats." When I walked out, I didn't look back. I didn't rebuild the company right away. Instead, I started something smaller, in my father's name, a scholarship fund for local students who wanted to study business the right way. Every penny came from my restored shares. That, to me, was the truest revenge, turning the damage he caused into something good. Weeks later, the newspaper printed a short article. Local family business faces audit. Ownership restored to founder's daughter. No drama. No headlines. Just quiet justice, and that's how I wanted it to be. Some nights, I still sit by that same desk. The numbers are long settled, the papers locked away. But sometimes I open the drawer again, see my father's letter, and smile. Revenge didn't need noise. It needed truth, patience, and silence sharper than any weapon. And in that silence, I found peace. If this story struck something inside you, if you've ever seen greed try to erase what's right, then subscribe for more true stories of betrayal and justice, because sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's the start of revenge done right.